Pitching departments are obsessed with pitchers who cut their fastballs. I spent last week at the winter meetings and Wake Forest's player development seminar, and if I had one large takeaway from all the conversations I had, this was it. Now, if you zoom out and look at the average shape of four-seam fastballs in MLB over the last 5 seasons, it kind of looks like I'm making stuff up. Four-seamers have actually added arm side movement. This horizontal number has increased since 2021, which implies that pitchers are cutting their fastballs less, not more. For this to line up with my observation, we have to flip our perspective. Teams are throwing fewer four-seam fastballs. Usage has fallen 3.7 percentage points since 2021. So 1 in every 10 four-seamers you saw back in 2021 is no longer a four-seamer in the present day. It feels to me like the population of four-seamers in Major League Baseball is subtly skewing towards the kind that grade out really well in stuff models. These are more of the power ride-run types. Teams want pitchers that cut their fastballs, not necessarily because they're gonna throw that cut four-seam fastball shape a lot, but because they love what it tells them about the pitcher. That cut says that this arm will probably be able to throw a bunch of different pitch types. Now, I fumbled a lot in my preseason bold predictions video, but the one thing that I nailed is that 2025 was in fact the year of the pitch mix. Repertoires for starting pitchers expanded more rapidly than they have probably at any point in the history of the sport. As MLB's David Adler put it, the number of starting pitchers throwing 5 or more pitches in MLB last year is 35% higher than it was in 2019, and 10% higher than it was just 2 years ago. There's this concept in baseball known as seam shifted wake or seam effects that has been the catalyst for how quickly pitchers are expanding their mix. Now, this idea is basically that by subtle orientation differences in the baseball, you can influence the resulting movement of the pitch. This is because by changing those orientations, you're essentially changing where the seams gather on a baseball as it moves to the plate, and this influences the airflow around the ball to create some imbalance and move the pitch perhaps in unexpected ways. Go back to 2021 and we mostly thought seam effects occurred on sinkers and maybe changeups, and while they do, it's now firmly entrenched in a lot of different pitch types, most popularized perhaps by the sweeper revolution. There was even this pretty incredible tool created on X that shows where the seams gather on the ball based on a number of variables. Now, this is a projection, but I think we can assume it's roughly similar to what a lot of organizations have internally. The more pronounced yellow line on this virtual ball is a higher concentration of seams that you'll get throughout ball flight. And this causes the airflow around the ball to detach at different points, creating a wake that influences the movement in the directions you want. You're essentially engineering for where that yellow is on the ball and how that affects the resulting movement. When you have none of this yellow, the seams are not sticking on one part of the ball long enough to create these effects. And this non-yellow situation is more frequent in arms, you guessed it, that don't cut their fastballs. This cut needed to induce seam effects is not binary. It's not like you have it or you don't. It exists on a spectrum, and we can measure it publicly through something called spin efficiency. For four-seam fastballs, this ranges from 100% usually to about 70% or so. The 70% guys are Cade Horton, Sonny Gray. They cut their fastball a ton. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you end up with guys like Cole Reagans, 99%, 98%, and the median is somewhere around about 92 to 93%. Now, this isn't the only way to ID this. It's just the one that I believe is most accessible publicly. If you talk to some organizations, understanding things like gyro degree and feel around a pitcher's hand in terms of how they're actually getting to release and able to set that specific kind of gyro are probably more important in fully getting a picture of who's a seam effects candidate, so to speak. But this spectrum, I think, does a good baseline job of understanding who is a candidate for this topic. Maybe the simpler way to think about this is just by looking at an arm that throws a bunch of different shapes. Take Trey Gibson of the Orioles, a AAA arm that I think is one of the best prospects in baseball from a pitching standpoint. Now, you don't even really need to understand what's going on in plots like this, but just look to the left of this vertical line. These are all Gibson's shapes that break to his glove side. He throws 4 of them: a cutter, sweeper, curveball, and a downer slider. He also has a pair of fastballs, a four-seamer, and a sinker, alongside a lightly used changeup. At Wake Forest's player development seminar, I hosted a panel with the pitching coaches from the Astros and the Orioles, and the bullpen coaches of the Red Sox and Blue Jays. And one thing that we discussed was how important it is to give hitters multiple problems to solve. It's a simple concept, but one that's necessary given how good hitters are getting. Gibson has 7 pitches, and I'll emphasize the diversity of these 4 breaking balls again. He can morph based on the kind of hitter that he's facing. Is he up against a righty? He can focus on more sink, cut, sweep. Is he facing a lefty? He can go 4-seam, more downer slider, maybe curveball. He can even adapt based on your bat path. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have pitchers who don't do a great job cutting their fastball, those towards the high end of our spin efficiency spectrum that we pointed out. Their plots often have very little to the left of this vertical line. Now, this doesn't mean they're a bad pitcher. Kevin Gossman's plot looks like this, and he's really good. It just means their arsenal possibilities are restricted. They're probably not going to throw 6 to 7 good pitches and 4 breaking balls like Trey Gibson. As I presently understand it, the reason these higher efficiency types can't create the same level of mixed diversity as those who cut their fastballs has to do with where their hand is positioned at release. For guys who create more ride-run fastball shapes or have higher efficiency, they're often behind the ball more on a variety of their pitch types. Whereas if you cut your ball a bit, you're ever so slightly more on the side of the baseball at release. And the big difference between these two things is simply where the seams are oriented relative to the airflow coming at the ball at that point of release. And that's really what seam effects are. You're trying to set the seams of the baseball at that point of release in a way such that you could create that lapping of the seams, or that yellow we showed on the purple and yellow ball, to create some imbalance of the wake and influence the movement. And it just so happens that guys who are behind the ball have a lower probability of being able to set their seams in the proper way to create the movement that teams are trying to hunt. Certain teams just get seam shift more than others, whether that's through the investment in R&D and technology, or perhaps just the investment in the individuals who've been on the cutting edge of this revolution, you can call it. Their pitching departments know they can develop it, and the acquisition side of things in those orgs is set up to properly funnel the kinds of arms that development wants into the org. And if you know where to look, you could kind of see these tendencies. The Red Sox drafted 3 pitchers in the first 3 rounds of the 2025 draft. All of them cut their fastball and are big dudes. The latter is a topic probably for another day. They also just traded for Sonny Gray, who cuts the heck out of his fastball. Michael King is a name I've championed a lot this offseason, both on MLB Network at the winter meeting, shout out to Ron Darling for being awesome, and on Marquee Sports Network, because he represents this idea of how cutting your fastball can lead to a bunch of different shapes, many of which generate a ton of whiff and gain movement in flight through these seam effects that we're talking about. So I'm really not surprised that we're seeing rumors there are a bunch of teams trying to sign a guy like Michael King, one of which is the Red Sox, and another of which is rumored to be the Yankees, who are also on the cutting edge of this. The Cubs, who cut their fastballs more than anybody in the minor leagues. How about the Orioles, who were sharp enough to get Trey Gibson into the repertoire that he currently has? Now, maybe it's just that King is affordable and has upside, but even if that is a reason why, I'm sure it's not the only reason. So to recap, certain orgs know they can weaponize seam effects, and as a byproduct of that, they're targeting pitchers who cut their fastballs, because we at least presently understand that as one of the most obvious ways to get to these massive seam-shifted repertoires. And as a byproduct of that, we are in the era of massive pitch mixes. And mix expansion is not going anywhere. I think it's just going to continue. Maybe not at as rapid of a rate as we saw from 24 to 25, but mixes will continue to expand. And as I think ahead to what might be the larger trends of 2026, I admit I'm a bit stumped. As much as last year was the year of the mix, it was also the year of the kick changeup. Changeups had more velocity and drop than they pretty much have ever had. And I think we're getting to the point where there may not be any more pitch types to name and come up with. No, that is not a challenge. You have these massive mixes. How do you optimize the usage of that mix? Baseball Savant added a tool on their game breakdowns or live game tracking that I absolutely love. It's a snapshot of how the pitcher used their shapes each time through the order. World Series Game 2, Yoshinobu Yamamoto is a great example of playing around with sequencing as he sees a lineup. In that Game 2, he threw 52% splitter, first time through, then he went fastball heavy, and then third time through, he mixed in a bunch of cutters and threw some curveballs. He's usually about 40% fastball first time through, then he starts to throttle up his split, before bringing in more peripheral weapons. This is the foundation of what I'm talking about. The best pitchers in MLB don't have large issues as they see hitters more in a given game, whereas more average pitchers often do have pretty large third time through issues. And you can argue that more average pitchers are incentivized to expand their mixes even more. For starting pitchers, I think we're past the use your best pitch more idea and into a land that resembles something roughly similar to poker randomizers, the land of unpredictability. You hear this concept of being unpredictable all the time from analysts and coaches, but I'm not entirely sure we're quantifying it or measuring it. And if you're not measuring, then you're probably not able to improve. Now, I'm not saying that pitchers should entirely randomize their mix. There's obviously certain spots where they should use certain offerings at a preferred rate, but it's worth noting that we as humans do a pretty poor job of attempting to randomize when prompted to do so. In one study, they asked a group to give the results of a coin toss, basically put heads or tails through potential, let's say, 50 outcomes, and it was clear that when compared to pure randomization, humans both avoided repetition and over-alternated. AKA, they're not random at all, but rather, even when prompted to be random, they were pretty predictable. So as a pitcher, if you're in a 1-0 spot and you have 3 pitches that have similar expected run values versus that particular hitter, you could theorize that if a human, the catcher, is trying to be unpredictable in that spot, they would actually show a tendency. And perhaps with all the data and information we have in organizations, I wouldn't be surprised if certain teams are picking up on these tendencies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this mix evolution to me is perhaps so powerful that it's not going to go away. We're not going to get to the point where mixes are contracted. What I think might happen is that we're going to converge in terms of pitch quality. We're going to run into guys who have so many shapes that are so similar that we start to lean towards this concept of randomization in terms of how we're using these pitches in specific spots to specific hitters. Now, as I like to say, never wrong, just early. I'm not entirely sure if this is something that's going to happen directly in 2026, but perhaps the way we can measure it is by looking at the more average starting pitchers in baseball, whether in the next, say, 3 or 4 years, their third time through the order penalty starts to drop a bit to the point where, dare I say, we start to get pitchers going deeper into games. Now, maybe we move that way through rule changes, perhaps we get less games on the schedule and roster limits of some kind where teams are then forced to actually develop pitchers to push through orders multiple times. And maybe that begets what I'm talking about here, where we get into this concept of randomization. But it's not unrelated to what I talked about in another video in regards to the Miami Marlins calling pitches from the dugout. They did it in a much more simple way, but to me, what they were trying to get at is this concept we're talking about, trying to basically angle into usage patterns, and then perhaps as they layer their strategy down in the future, start to really get into randomization, not through the catcher thinking he's being unpredictable, but through literal mathematical randomness that could help a pitcher create swings from a hitter that all the time, we call them swords by pitching ninja, just awkward, uncomfortable situations for the hitter. That's essentially the goal of a pitcher. And I feel like baseball will move towards that task. So I hope this video wasn't too advanced for you or too complex, but as I often say for a lot of my stuff, the things I'm thinking about and ingesting from other people, I try to consolidate and push to you guys. So I hope it did it in a way that was somewhat legible and created an interesting narrative for you to follow along for this 12 or so minutes of a video. Thanks as always for engaging with my content. I've been slow over the last month or so in terms of posting. Was doing a lot, was prepping for the Wake Conference, winter meetings, some other stuff, but we're starting to kick back into gear. I got exposed to a lot of cool ideas out at Wake in the winter meeting. So I have some things in the queue. Hopefully we'll be ripping through opening day. It's only like 60, 70 days away. So what do you know? We'll be in 2026 very soon. Take care.